Okay, well, thank you again. Thanks, Mark, and good to remind Amanda about that. So I'm going to be talking again about the upper Scioto watershed and give you an update on the modeling. So just to begin with, I'm going to talk a little bit about what is it that we're trying to do with the modeling. So what we're doing here, this first slide shows the various layers of information that we look at for putting together a watershed scale model that is going to look at water flow, the hydrology, as well as the water quality, what's happening in our waters. So we take, for example, the topography, the land uses, the water that's used for those land uses, for example, for different crops and for different human consumption, the application of fertilizers and other things that are needed, the subbasins that we want to consider, the soil types, and all of these pieces of information. And in addition, we take into account the climate, operations, management practices like tile drainage, point sources, out of the piece of information. And the objective is to be able to make predictions about what happens to stream flow, nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment loadings, and in some cases, we can also look at crop yield and see how those things may be affecting it. So that's just kind of the layers of information that we use for any watershed modeling, regardless of the model requires this information. Underneath, within the model structure, there's many processes, and I'm not going to go through all of them here, just to show you here, for example, just for understanding what happens in terms of river flow and the whole hydrologic cycle, the water cycle, how we take into account things like the rainfall, snow melt, evaporation, used by the crops, infiltration, groundwater. All of these things have to be taken into consideration within the modeling framework. And for water quality, it gets even more detailed because there we need to track a whole bunch of different processes that are occurring, different things that happen as we apply, for example, fertilizer to the crops use that fertilizer. Some of it leaches down into our groundwaters, others moves with runoff. There's also some atmospheric deposition from the atmosphere. There's urban sources like point sources that discharge nutrients into the watershed. And then there's a whole set of processes that occur also within the soils and in our rivers and streams within the watershed. The model that we're going to be talking about today is called the SWAT model, the soil water model. And this model is basically one that is was developed by the University of Texas, Texas A&M, to look at basically the operations in an agricultural setting. So it's very appropriate for the type of work that we're going to be looking at here. It is a very well-known model. It's been around for over 3 decades, has had many iterations. And the version that we're going to be using now is called SWAT Plus, which is the most recent version. And that was a conversation that we had early on in the project to decide what version to use and which model we would be using. So as you see here again, there's many processes that are taken into account within the model. So the SWAT model requires a set of input data sets, like the climate ones related, for example, precipitation, temperature, and so on, the land use, the soil types, the topography. All of that goes into building the actual SWAT model, fertilizer use, water consumption, management practices, and that gives us our output, which can be at very different scales, both spatial scales as well as temporal scales. So the model can be run and predicts things at the daily level, and then we can average that to the monthly or the yearly, the annual level, and it can give us information at the larger scale for the entire watershed, for a particular river or reach segment that we call, or for a smaller section, a sub-watershed, or even at the level of sections within a sub-watershed. So it can give information at very different levels and scales. I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions on basically just the big picture modeling. And I'll give a few seconds for people to ask any questions. Do we have anything on the chat box, Mark or Brian?
Not yet.
Okay. So sorry, that was the soil water assessment tool. I blanked that when I was talking about it before. Anyway, okay, so I'll move forward, but again, if there's any questions later on, I can come back to this. So now moving into where are we modeling? So it's the upper Scioto watershed. And so this is that region shown here. just north west of Columbus, Ohio. I've been out there a couple times to the region as part of my modeling. As Mark mentioned, I've been involved with the Ohio River Nutrient Trading Program for over a decade now, from its beginning. And so it's this region up here. It's a section of the full Scioto, but it's this region right above Columbus, Ohio, north of Columbus, Ohio. And so here is the land use, and I'm sure many of you are very familiar with it, shown here in the different colors, and we have the legend there, are the different land uses that are being considered for this region, for the Upper Scioto. And so this is from a National Land Cover data set that's provided by the USGS. It's based on remote sensing, but it's also checked. They check the ground truthing, they call it, to make sure that in fact it's accurate. So we see that most of this is in cultivated crops, and as you know, mostly grain crops. There are some regions there with urban areas. So we have 4 urban areas, not a lot. Marion is probably the largest one within the watershed, and then Kenton, Ohio, and Marysville. And then it's just north of Columbus, Ohio, but we actually have some of that urban area in the bottom or the southeastern corner of the watershed. There's also some pasture lands, some other land uses, as well as a number of forested areas. And as we see, there's some areas that contain waterways, wetlands, and other types of waters. This is from the 2016 data set, and that's the most recent that's available from the USGS. And then we updated also, so I should stay there. We update that with the cropland data layer that the USDA that has much more detail about those cultivated crops. What are they? And that's what helps us to then look at the actual agricultural land use distribution. So shown here is a pie chart of the various land uses that we considered for this region. The most common ones are soy, corn, or corn-soy rotation. And it seems like, why do we have both of them? Well, some of these, because they're rotations, almost half of the rotation is in soy, and then the other one is in corn. So it allows us to take into account the fact that at any one time, at any one year, roughly half of it is in one or the other crop of that rotation. So those two account for almost, it's a little bit over 40% of the watershed. Soybeans, 18%, hay, 14% roughly, and so on. And so we have here the major uses that were considered for this particular watershed and for designing how we would treat the various operations in the watershed.
Arturo, this is Mark Wilson. I just wanted to clarify that on the soybean, it's straight soybean, no rotation out of that crop. So we estimated that 18% of the land was just in a straight soybean crop.
Thank you, Mark. And also the one further down that says corn, that's a straight corn. So only 3% actually of the land is just corn. And then a little further down, there's a wheat, corn, and soy rotation, which is just under 2%. So not a lot of that particular rotation in this region. And this information can be updated, but this was done based on the information we had at that point. So one thing we have to do for the modeling is to sort of subdivide our watershed into what I'm going to call catchments. There are various ways of talking about these. One could talk about the whole watershed and some watersheds, but then certain regions can be put together to make these. So I'm going to call these catchments. And the USGS has a particular nomenclature for them. They call them HUC 12s. It's a coding system that they have. They've divided the entire nation into these different units. And for example, shown here are the 32 HUC 12s, or the 32 catchments that comprise the watershed. So we use this so that we're modeling at a very refined scale. Each one of them is on the order of a few tenths of square miles. So it allows us for a greater resolution for the modeling. Just as an example, previously we had done modeling for the Ohio Nutrient Trading Program, and at that time, because it was a much larger area, we were using HUC 10s, which basically in this image would have shown maybe 6 or 7 instead of 32. So a lot more resolution was done for this particular modeling. Here they are as well. The idea is not to go through all of them, just to give you an idea of what these numbers mean. They're actually connected to different parts of the Scioto River, for example, the headwaters, which is all of that region is on the northwestern part of the watershed. And then the Little Scioto is the arm that's coming from the northeastern part of the watershed. And then there's a number of creeks, some major ones like Mill Creek and others that are smaller, that are considered within the watershed. And we have all the connectivity that's important for the model to know, okay, from this region, it drains to this region, and that captures water that then drains to the next region. So we have all of that in the watershed. The other information that's shown here is the area. And one thing we note is that the area varies. It's not exactly the same. It has to do with what drains into that particular part of the river or that particular creek. And so it shows the size of those catchments. And again, they're varying from on the order of, let's say, 13 square miles to all the way up to about 80 square miles. Next, we look at the topography. Shown here is the topography based on the USGS information. This is a very refined data set. It's called the National Elevating Data Set, and it's given to us in meters, but just to sort of put it into perspective, into feet, we multiply roughly by 3. So the lower elevations are on the order of 600 to 700 feet, and then the higher elevations are closer to 1,300, maybe a little bit more feet. But by and large, it's a relatively flat watershed. And so, as you know, the drainage affects the rate at which water is going to be draining from that watershed. We have some of the higher parts in the western side of the watershed shown there in kind of an orange-yellow color. We also look at the soil types and their properties. One that's particularly important for this modeling is the infiltration, and that's measured by the hydraulic conductivity. So hydraulic conductivity is a measure of how well a soil allows water to go infiltrating into it vertically from the surface or laterally into in groundwater towards the rivers. And so we see there, most of it is regions of relatively low to medium hydraulic conductivity. There in red are shown a region of slightly higher, but most of the soils in this region here are actually relatively low hydraulic conductivity, clayey soils. And so that's important for us to represent there. And in fact, there are some regions there in yellow which are showing very low hydraulic conductivity. And those regions, not surprisingly, are areas that tend to pond, so water accumulates in them. And if we went back to the land use map, we would see that those are regions where we have wetlands because of their low hydraulic conductivity, low infiltration rates. Another factor that's important is soil erodibility, how easy a soil will erode, and how that will first capture sediments, but more importantly, things that are attached to sediments like phosphorus. And so phosphate attaches very well to soils. And so here we see that even though we have regions of low erodibility, there are a number of regions here which have fairly large erodibility. And so some of those become important contributors to the transport of nutrients into our waterways. So SWAT takes all this information again, lays down all this information, and we generate these so-called HRUs, which are what is called a hydrologic response unit. So for different areas that have this similar soil and land use and slope, we catalog that as a hydrologic response unit. And so in each one of those catchments that I showed before, there'll be dozens of these hydrologic response units. And overall, we broke the whole watershed into 877 of these by looking at commonality in terms of land use and soils. That allows us to represent much more appropriately what is happening at the level of the subunits within a watershed catchment. Sorry. Next, we look at the climate information. And so here we look for stations, meteorological stations that provide us with rainfall, temperature records, wind speed, and so on. And shown here are some of the ones that we were able to find for the watershed. We get these from They have a National Climatic Data Center where they collect data sets that are very useful for us, daily information from many of these different stations. So shown here are these different stations. One thing we do note is that there's almost nothing in the middle of the watershed. And as we know, sometimes a particular region may be getting rainfall, but just near it, there is no rainfall, or it happens a bit later or earlier in the day. And so that is something that's important for us to have that information. It may actually shift in terms of not being that particular day, but being the next day. So we looked at this data, we tried to use it for calibration, and we found a number of inconsistencies in terms of how we were modeling the timing of the storms. So after talking with some of the SWAT model developers, they recommended that we use a different data set that is called the PRISM data set. And this is a data set that uses that same information, but that now has sort of mapped it out in a nice, even way across the watershed. And so that's what we're doing here. We see here what happens, for example, the average annual precipitation in the watershed. And then we can see very clearly that there are some regions that get a lot more rainfall, particularly near Kenton, and some other regions, again, that northwestern region gets less precipitation in general. So we use that, and as you'll see, that helped us a lot to improve the timing of the storms, which is an important factor for modeling adequately what's happened in the watershed. We also use information about temperatures. We started with the daily level. This is just to show you that there are significant differences in the average minimum temperatures across the watershed. Even though it's a fairly small region, there are regions that are particularly cooler, others that are particularly warmer. And so we take all of that into account, again, using daily data. Here I'm showing the average annual temperatures, but just to give you a sense of the differences that we have in the watershed. Next, we add in the point sources. So these are basically either wastewater treatment plants, and in this region, most of them are fairly small wastewater treatment plants, except for those in the city of Marion, Ohio. Others are other dischargers that have a permit. So anyone that has a permit with Ohio EPA will be taken into consideration. And Mark Wilson helped us get that information from Ohio EPA, which was really very helpful for us. So we take all that information, add it all up, and input it into the model to represent correctly what's happening in terms of the loading from these point sources. So these are sources that have a direct discharge into a stream, creek, river, or other water body. They have a pipe, and therefore they need a permit, and so they're reporting that information to Ohio EPA. This is a depiction of the average point source daily load. How much are they discharging? And I've summed it up here by each one of these catchments, starting out from the numbering from left to right. And so what we have here is that in some catchments, there's no load. There are basically no point sources of significance, no one with a permit. In others, there's a little bit of load. And then I've highlighted 3 of them here, which have the more significant load, but they're still fairly small. I've kept the units in kilograms per day, but to put them into pounds per day, multiply by 2.2. So for example, 100 kilograms per day would be 220 per day. We have a couple, 3 of them that exceeded in terms of the total number, getting closer to about 600 pounds per day. And then total phosphorus is an order of magnitude, about a factor of 10 smaller. So again, these are relatively small. There's only 3 locations where we have significant point sources, but as we'll see later on, they really are not a very important part of the loading in this particular part of the watershed. If you went down south of, in Columbus, Ohio, of course, then you get to the very big wastewater treatment plants in the city of Columbus, but these are not represented here. They're not in this watershed.
Arturo,
yes.
Mark Wilson again. From left to right, those watersheds that you're looking at, 303, that's the city of Marion.
Yes.
304 is the watershed just below the city of Marion. And then 604, that's lower Mill Creek, just below Marysville, just for reference.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Mark. Yes. So those are, again, as Mark pointed out, those are the 3 main ones that we have here. And here's, for example, the data for the city of Marion, Ohio. the one that Mark was pointing out, the one that ends in 303. And so we see here, for example, their average daily discharge. First thing to note is that it varies quite a bit. This is on the left-hand side is the nitrogen load, and on the right-hand side is the phosphorus load. The scale is the same, so we see that there's quite a bit more discharge of nitrogen than phosphorus. But the other important thing is to see there's a lot of variability on a daily basis. That has to do with flow rates. It also has to do with treatment. These are biological treatment processes, as well as what's coming from the loading that happens in those particular regions there. Storm events can also affect them because many of these may have some storm water that reaches the wastewater treatment plant. And so depending on how they're treating their sewers, they a bit of storm water, and that would dilute things, and in dry periods that would increase the concentrations. And so we have here the various components of total nitrogen and total phosphorus. Next, we look at agriculture, and as we saw in the map before, of course, this is the most significant source of loading for the watershed. And so thanks to Mark, and he, I know, worked with some of you, we obtain information, for example, on the management operations for different crops. I'm showing just an example for the corn soybean rotation that we talked about before. We see here the model uses the information at a fairly high level of detail. For example, we have first the year, so there's 2 years of the rotation, so we have to specify what happens in year 1, which is the corn's part of the rotation, and year 2, the soybean part of the rotation. On what month different operations occur, in what days, and then what are the operations that occur. So we see there, for example, there's tilling, there's planting, there's fertilizer application, harvesting, planting soybeans, harvesting, and so on. And so we see that there's, planting early in May, and then fertilizer application in May and June. And then for the soybean rotation, there's an application late in the fall. So it's all the way up to October. And that's for getting it ready for the corn rotation that's coming next. And then Mark was provided us with the information. This case is for MAP as the fertilizer, how much is applied for the various crops at different points in the rotation. So we have one of these for each one of the various crops, the corn, soybean, the soybean corn, for corn only, for soybean only, and for the wheat, corn, and soybean rotations, we have this information. And then also, I do want to mention that we've considered tile drainage in all grain crop fields, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. So again, showing here some of the types of operations that are being considered. So the model is pretty descriptive of what is happening in terms of these various operations. I'll stop there and see if there's any questions or comments on this.
So if you're not able to read your chat, Mark just put really a question in the chat box. Any reaction by the farmers on the call to the management practices or others? And then I see here Harold responded, all good, thanks. So if you have any thoughts, feel free to either enter it in the chat or unmute yourself and speak up. Comment from Jan Lehman, looks fairly close to me.
That's good to hear. Great. Okay, so we can come back to this. I'm going to move on to tile drainage. And so here is the information that we use in the model to describe how these tile drainage operations occur. So we have, for example, the depth down to the drain tube, and that's about 36 inches. The time to drain the soil to field capacity, about 24 hours. The drainage tile lag time, the effective radius of the drains. And right now we have a 0.8 inch effective radius. That may be a bit on the small side, so I would love to hear comments about that. Distance between 2 drain tubes, about 66 feet. And the drainage coefficient is more a parameter that's used for how fast it can drain in terms of inches of water per day. So again, if you have any thoughts, we'd love to hear about them and get feedback on these, because tile drainage actually plays a very important role in how water moves through the system, because it is an important component of the hydrologic cycle.
Let me interject here. We made the assumption that for cropland, 100% of the cropland, at least in this initial run of the model, 100% of the cropland is subject to tile drainage. And as Arturo pointed out, well, Jan Lehman raises a good point here. No way you get a half-inch drainage coefficient on 66-foot spacing. Jan has some experience and background in drainage.
Okay.
Again, we're trying to make one size fits all, at least at the moment here. We recognize there's differences, and as Arturo pointed out, we do believe we have an error in the effective radius of the drain tile. We were oversight on my part, I believe, and we're probably going to try and adjust it back to a 4-inch or a 2-inch.
There's a two-inch radius, yeah. So if we have that, better information on the drainage coefficient, again, if half an inch is, it's a no way, it's that value, then we'd like to hear that. We'd like to use as close as possible to what people's experiences are, because that will play an important role. So, yeah.
Jan Lehman raised the point, I think he pushed a pencil here, that 66-foot spacing would result in closer to 2/10 of a drainage coefficient instead of a half-inch.
Okay.
So we may want to dial that in a little better.
Right. And are the 66 feet distance adequate? Is that something that's the typical, or is that too small, too large?
We'll wait for Lehman or Harold or some of the other guys. My sense is, 30-foot spacing is on the tighter side, but Jan, you want to weigh in?
Well, I think we normally figured about a 3/8 coefficient on a 40-foot spacing. So if you're going to get a half-inch coefficient, you got to have bigger mains and you got to have them tighter together than that. So I'm not arguing on your 66-foot spacing. A lot of it's even wider than that, but your drainage coefficient's nowhere near 0.5.
Okay.
Which, for those that don't understand, the drainage coefficient is the amount of water. So that would say we could remove a half-inch per day.
Right.
And
Okay,
then,
so that's what that is. So on a 66-foot spacing, we're going to be more like a quarter.
Yeah. Okay.
and then Harold Waters commented that as far as distance between tiles runs, 40 to 50 feet is probably more normal today as far as that distance between the tile runs.
On pattern drainage, yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. That's the kind of input that is really useful at this point. Okay. So next,
Could I ask a question before we move on?
sure.
I apologize, but what is effective radius of drains? What is a definition for that? Because 0.8 inches seems small.
Yeah,
me.
right. So and we understand that it may be small. It's the radius of the drain pipe. So, for example, we typically think of a 2-inch pipe. That would be the diameter. The radius would be 1 inch, but in fact, because it's not exactly because of the thickness of the pipe, it may be less than an inch. But again, I think 2-inch pipe is probably too small, and I think after talking to Mark, I think we probably should move that to at least a 4-inch pipe, which would be a 2-inch radius, roughly.
Yeah, so typically we would be putting in 4-inch tile for drainage across the field, and then 6-inch, 8-inch, 12-inch mains, whatever.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so as I mentioned, next, once we have the model set up, the next thing is to sort of see how well the model predicts things. So we have 4 USGS gauge stations. One of them is at LaRue, the site at LaRue. And then there's another one that is by Ottawa Creek. It's called, we call these, instead of the big number, I call them Reach 16, 22, 26 will be Mill Creek. And then Reach 32 is the Scioto at the O'Shaughnessy Dam. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Anyway, so those are our 4 locations where we have long-term USGS gauges to compare to our modeling results. So here are the modeling results for the various locations. The first one is the one at LaRue. And we see there that, in general, we get the storm timing right. And this is much better than we had when we were trying to use the other data sets that I mentioned before. So the NOAA data sets, this is using Prism, much better. There's a disconnect between the height of the storms. In some of the storms, the simulated is smaller. But down below, I show the water balance. And so we see that, for example, for that first one, it's on the left-hand side. On the upper part is the daily flow, and the bottom part is the cumulative flow. So what we do is we look at, for example, in this case, from January 2010 to December 2018, what is the average flow, the flow for every day, sorry, not the average, but the daily rate at the top. And at the bottom, I add it all up to see, is my water balance adequate? Is the water that's being transported by the river within what I expect it to be, what I measured to be with the gauges? And so we see there that after adjustment of different parameters, we get a balance that is about 101.1%. So that's a very good match to the overall water balance. We see there's a little bit of areas where we have some disconnect, where the simulation is higher in some cases and it's a little bit lower. But so at least the amount of water that's moving through the watershed is accurate at this particular location. And then there's a number there. The NSC is the National Sutcliffe coefficient. It's a efficiency coefficient. It's a measure of how good our match is. And a 0.8 is pretty good. We have on the right-hand side another one that shows a slightly lower coefficient. So again, we see some disconnect in terms of the large storms, but the water balance here is actually very tight, 99.6%. This is the next gauge down. And then we have here the other 2 gauges. The one on the right-hand side would be the one at Mill Creek. Sorry, the one on the left-hand side is Mill Creek. The one on the right is all the way down at the bottom of the watershed. So again, we have very good water balances, so we've tried to match that as closely as we can. We see that, for example, as flow occurs, there's a storm event, and there's the recession down through the groundwater, we see that it matches that well. But we're having more flow there than would be expected in terms of what we call base flow, not storm flow, but during the drier periods, and matching the overall size of the storms. And it's a balance between getting the amount of water, the storm size correctly, and the water quality. So we had to make some trade-offs to sort of get everything as closely as possible as we can. But one of the main factors here is trying to get the water balance to be accurate so that we're moving the right amount of water throughout the whole system. Next, we looked at water quality, and although we have a lot of water quality stations, I'm going to focus on 4 of them at the same location so that it's consistent. The Scioto at LaRue, Scioto at Ottawa Creek, the Mill Creek one, and then at the dam at the bottom of the watershed. So shown here, these are a little bit busier, so let me explain what we're seeing here. Again, it's a time series from 2000 to 2018 that we have there. In red, the red dots are the observed data. The blue-green dots are the predicted data. This is what the model predicts. And then we have concentrations on the y-axis. And shown is the various locations, the one at LaRue, the one a little bit further down, the Mill Creek, and then all the way at the bottom of the watershed, the various reaches, and the concentration for nitrate and for ammonia. So by and large, the nitrate concentrations are fitting quite well. It's in the range of the observed concentration, so the predictions are quite good for nitrate. Note that we have also basically no observations prior to 2009, mostly 2000 to 2019. And so we basically have to work with that period for calibration. But again, nitrate, we do a quite a good job. And because that's the major component of total nitrogen, I feel that we're modeling the total amount of nitrogen moving through the system quite well. The one that shows the ammonia, which would be the right-hand side on those little graphs, is showing that we're a bit on the lower end of predicting ammonia, except for Reach 26 and Mill Creek. We're right there in the middle of the observed data. And the slightly higher observed amount of ammonia could reflect the fact that the river is lower in oxygen, and so allowing for more production of ammonia. And so that's something that we are not able to capture as well. But it's not a big change. And if you look at the scale on those, we're talking about going from, let's say, 0.1 to 0.2 milligrams per liter of ammonia.
Arturo, I
Yeah.
want to ask a quick question here. We had a question on the chat. So Brooke White asked, and this is going back a slide or two, do you feel like you miss transport dynamics without representing the flashiness of the flow?
We do have some, and that's part of what I was mentioning, we have to make some balances. So yeah, we do miss some of the transport dynamics. These, by not having the large storms, we're not getting as much transport of sediments out of the watershed. But one thing we observed, as we'll see in a little bit, is that I'm trying to balance the phosphorus. And we've had, it's been a challenge trying to get the model to predict the phosphorus as adequately as I would like it. And so one thing we've sort of make a balance is the size of those storms versus the amount of phosphorus that we see moving through the ocean. So that is correct, that you have to make some trade-offs, and it doesn't always reflect the precise transport that we may expect.
Okay.
So here in these slides, we're seeing, again, the 4 reaches. And then on the left hand of each one of those is the total phosphorus. And then the right hand of each one of those is the soluble phosphate. And so we see that in general, the total is over predicted. And that's something that we've seen with this particular model, and we've adjusted parameters to try to get it a little closer, but it seems to be still over predicting that phosphorus. And that's why if I increase the size of those storm flow events, then I get a lot more phosphorus moving through the system. So it's a balance between how much we represent that versus how much we see here. It seems that it doesn't affect nitrogen. The total nitrogen seems to be fine, but the total phosphorus is the one that is being affected by that. So we're still working on that, trying to adjust these a bit better, but I think we're close to sort of the limits of where we can push the model to give us that. Curiously enough, the soluble phosphorus, which is only a very small fraction of the total, is under-predicted by the model. So we're trying to figure out also how to best balance those two by adjusting parameters in the model. So again, this is work in progress that we're showing at this point, but just to give you an idea of where we are. Next, just to see what happens in terms of the loads. These are, first here are the total nitrogen loads in pounds of nitrogen per day. It's the average. And shown here, for example, are all the various catchments that we have there. And we see this is going down the river, so down the watershed. As we start out from the left-hand side, we pick up more and more of the Scioto River, and so the load continues to increase. The ones that keep on going up is the Scioto River picking up load from the smaller creeks. The smaller creeks make their contribution, but that adds to that load. And I'm showing 2 simulations here, one using MAP and the other one using triple superphosphate. And so we see that there's a small but noticeable differences between those two in terms of the total nitrogen load. There's less nitrogen being transported in the triple superphosphate than in MAP. And again, these are the average daily loads down the watershed from 2010 to 2018.
Arturo, we
Yes.
had a question regarding the frequency of phosphorus monitoring. Are you catching all the rain events? And I'm wondering, one, what your answer might be to that, Arturo, but also I'm thinking a lot of that phosphorus monitoring data is from Ohio EPA. And if that's the case, maybe Dale White could weigh in on some of that as well. Arturo?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So, and that's a very good point. I should mention that, first of all, the data is collected by different agencies, but mostly Ohio EPA. That's where we got most of that data. And it may be that they go out there during a storm event, but it's very likely that they go out there on a particular timing. So I'm not sure exactly when that happens. So maybe Dale can answer that. The other point is that we're collecting data from several stations just because we can only model one location in the river, and so it may be reflecting several stations for a particular catchment. But there seems to be fairly significant consistency in the range of values that we are seeing in these various locations. So if Dale wants to sort of mention a little bit about timing.
And he mentions there's a blend of routine and storm event sampling.
Okay, right. So we should be capturing both, and that's what we would see here. So as I mentioned, then this is the load down the watershed, so how it builds up as it goes down the watershed. And then we can also do an analysis to see how much is the contribution in each of these catchments, in each one of these so-called HUC 12s. So we see there that there are some that contribute quite a bit more, and that has to do with the area, so the size of that particular catchment. It also has to do with the land use, but as we saw, most of them have a lot of uplands. That's probably not as big factor. And the third important factor, the soil type. And then for some of them, slope, a significant difference in slope, and that affects the load as well. So we see here, there's some of them, particularly 302 is right up there, just northeast of Marion, Ohio. That's the one that has the largest load. And then the other ones are a bit lower in terms of their loading. This is total nitrogen, average load per HUC 12. And then this is the total phosphorus again as it builds down the watershed from the upper parts all the way down to the discharge on the right-hand side. And so we see there that it's building up. And we see a bigger difference between scenarios, between the MAP scenario and the triple superphosphate, based on the information about the operations and the application of fertilizer for these two different scenarios. And here is the analysis of the load per catchment per HUC 12 for each one of them. And again, we see there are differences between those, and some of them have more load than others, reflecting, again, soil types, land use, crops that are being grown, and so on. What I was showing here, these are average out from 2010 to 2018, so it's the average loading. And I just wanted to show an example of the fact that the load itself is not constant. It varies actually quite a bit throughout the years. So shown here is the simulation for total load of nitrogen and phosphorus, total nitrogen in blue and total phosphorus in orange. And so what we see there is how these loads vary significantly, the pounds per day that we may have. Again, there was a question about whether this reflects accurately the transport during the very large storm events. These have been averaged to the monthly level. It's the daily load averaged to the monthly level to sort of capture this in a different way. But we see a couple months there that are really, really high loads of total nitrogen and a few others. And then there's periods where the loading is quite a bit less. And so these loads add up to make the total load that we see at the outlet of the watershed. So that's where we are at. And so the next steps that we have is to evaluate different BMPs. For example, manure versus MAP or triple superphosphate, other fertilizer options, the timing of fertilizer application, the use of cover crops, filter strips, constructed wetlands or detention ponds, other BMPs that the group would like to sort of evaluate. And then also look at the contribution of load from different HUC 12s, different catchments, the differences that the area, the soils, the crop types play, the seasonality of the contributions. And then I'll be putting together a final report on these modeling results later on in the year. And so that's where we are at this point. So I'm going to stop and see if there's any more questions and any comments.
I have another question from Heather Raymond. Any continuous daily sampling sites at USGS stations And then makes the comment, investing in an auto analyzer at a station could help with calibration and confidence in the model.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
And I do believe, Mark, if I recall correctly, there are a couple stations that do have, I don't want to say continuous sampling, but don't a couple of the USGS sites do water quality sampling?
Yeah, yes, they do.
Yeah.
They're the one. Go ahead, Tom. Tom Harris, are you on?
This is Tom Harris from USGS. And we have Scioto River Prospect that has continuous water quality parameters that we collect. And I believe it's a 5-parameter SON there, which is the 5 standard parameters, temperature, pH, DO, specific conductance, and turbidity. We do not collect any water quality samples or do not have a water quality monitor at the Scioto River at LaRue or Mill Creek. I think it was Mill Creek, was mentioned, Mill Creek,
Yep.
Belleville, I want to say.
Yep.
And so that's, and I forgot what the other site was. Actually, I've never heard of the other site. It was a Scioto River on Ottawa Creek or with Ottawa Creek. Is that what?
Yes.
I think that might be Prospect, Tom.
Yes. Yeah, it is.
Okay. Okay. Well, all right. So we call it Scioto River near Prospect. And that is the one that we do have the water quality monitor on.
Now, as you mentioned, it doesn't have nitrogen or phosphorus in those continuous monitoring parameters?
That's correct. It does not have those sensors.
And then I want to mention one other thing here. Both Harold and Jan Lehman responded about triple superphosphate and MAP or DAP. So that was actually a scenario that, you know, we just wanted to look at, and we had Arturo run to kind of see the difference. And I'll give you a little bit of update later. But we actually, looks like we would have a project that we would be doing at some scale in the watershed to potentially bring some triple superphosphate into the watershed for application purposes. So I'll talk about that a little bit later in the call as we give some updates on some other project activities. But that was just a scenario that we had Arturo run just so we could see what potential differences or compare those two sources of fertilizer of NMP to see what the differences might be. So just that's a response to Harold and Jan.
At this point, I believe Arturo has completed his slide deck, and perhaps we could open it up. It's 4 o'clock. We've got 15 minutes or so slated for discussion and conversation here, feedback on the modeling efforts as we currently see it. It is a work in progress. Anyone, and perhaps we can just work on the courtesy process here and open up the microphones and let people just begin to ask some questions. Any thoughts? Someone like to share or start in? I'd in particular like to hear some feedback from a couple of the folks who have some experience in modeling. If Dale White or Margaret, Jim Klang, anybody else is welcome, but what's your reactions to what we've done so far, what Arturo's done?
I got a note from Dale White. He's concerned that SRP matches are poor right now.
Mm-hmm.
So that I'm assuming he's referring to reactive phosphorus. Yeah,
yep.
soluble phosphorus.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Any thoughts, Dale, on what might tighten that up?
I'll go live here with voice. I think Arturo was saying it was a small percentage of the total load as well. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, it's about 10-20% of the total phosphorus. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And more about what are your plans to, I guess your total P matches were fairly in line, right? Is that?
Yeah, a little bit on the high side, which is, it's a little bit disconcerting that we're not able to bring up the reactive phosphorus, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, we're still at winners and, trying to get all of that balance in there, but yeah.
Your simulated total P, it over predicts. Is that?
A bit, it over predicts a bit, yeah.
Okay. Okay. Nothing immediate, Mark, to respond to with what SWAT is doing here. And I guess, the observed data that you're using, the parameter codes for those have been fishy in the past. I just, in terms of using the right code for SRP filtered and such. So I guess, did I send some emails earlier on that and using the right parameter codes?
Yes, you did. Yeah. So I think we got them all right, but I'll double check. That's a good point to double check our whether we're using the correct parameter codes for that.
Okay. Yeah, and we can maybe have an email back and forth on that too.
Sure. Okay. Thank you.
I guess I had an earlier question though about the management practices across the watershed. You showed a nice, one example there for one of the we're calling them catchments, right? In SWAT, those are assigned by HRU.
Yes.
Correct. Oh, okay.
Right.
So, were there any, Mark, in the past in Western Ohio, we looked at kind of regional differences within a watershed, a large watershed, of the distribution of management practices. Is there a trending there, in the directions of the compass, or how did you assign management scenarios across all of the catchment scale? Well, the HRU scale within each catchment.
Go ahead, Arturo.
So right now they're assigned the same to all of the various catchments. So the crop soil rotation, for example, the same management practice across the entire watershed. We can certainly do it, modifying it to do it, with a regional distribution. There could be higher or lower in different parts as needed. So that's something that we can certainly go into detail with.
So each HRU got the example scenario you showed was fixed across all HRUs. Is that what?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
The same HRUs with the same land use, yes. Crop type, yeah.
Yeah, true, yeah. You don't really have any further information to see why there would be regional differences across.
No, not yet. No, I don't.
Yeah, okay.
And that's, and I will just answer quickly, Dale, that's something that we want to refine as we refine the model over time. So, I know there's other activities, with different groups. And I think some things that we can do to, refine that look and an understanding of maybe regional or area differences in management activities. OACI, that's another group here in Ohio. They're going to be doing, there's assessment and certification process. So potentially would we be able to access some of that information to look at, differences in management practices? I was just perusing a site yesterday, CTIC, which is the Conservation Technology Information Center, has some data through satellite technology and satellite information that can kind of more help us refine potentially, some of the general practices such as conventional tillage, no-till, reduced tillage, the use of cover crops, things like that, we might want to use to input into the model to get a better sense of kind of what the baseline of current activities are. So that is something that we do want to refine, over time, But this is really a starting point for us in what we're putting together right now.
Sure, yeah, understandable. Well, that's good to know. You've got, your eyes on something like that in the coming months or whatever. Arturo, I don't recall, I might have turned away, but did you have any slides on matches to crop yields? Did you, with NAS data?
I didn't have any slides on that. I haven't gone too much into detail of that, but yeah, we could certainly look at that as well.
Okay.
A comment here from, I believe, Jim Klang. I'm a little concerned on how to gather good data on sediment loading and critical storms. The goodness of fit was low in some areas, and I understand you already see this. In Minnesota, with continuous monitoring, it can be a relatively small number of events, 3 storms, that can generate 75% of a year's loading in small watersheds. So just, I think, something that we need to keep in mind moving forward for us. And then Brooke commented, that seems key as high precipitation events are becoming more common over time in the watershed. And I think Jim did mention before, just thinking about seasonality and those high precipitation events. So, I think it's something that, we need to keep in mind as we kind of refine and think about things and how we adjust the model into the future.
Right.
We have about 10 minutes left in this portion of our agenda, and I wanted to see if people could give some thought to scenarios or comparisons that we might undertake in the next couple of months with Arturo's help, looking at different management practices across the watershed, and certainly trying to dial in on some specific regional uses of BMPs. I'll draw your attention to Arturo's slide. His last slide, he talks about cover crops and filter strips and constructed wetlands. What do you think would be some appropriate scenarios to try and evaluate?
And just quickly, while you're thinking, Arturo, I had one more question from Dale. Since 80% of the TP load is not from soluble phosphorus, it is worth examining the sediment prediction from SWAT. How was that fit?
So we're still adjusting the sediment load, but we do have quite a bit of sediment moving through the system, so that's why we have a high TP load compared to what we observed. But, yeah.
Have a comment from Harold Waters, cover crops at 50% cropland.
Okay.
Any thoughts on timing of fertilizer application? Any reason to look at more split applications and any increase or use of manure?
Harold also commented reduced tillage, maybe increase no-till acres. Heather commented, agree with Harold, that is likely. Wetlands are not, VRT is likely.
Why do you say wetlands are not very likely, Heather?
Oh, I was just starting to unmute. I think if you look at the H2 Ohio practice adoption and implementation, it kind of gives you a window into what practices, should additional funds become available, would be more likely. And I know wetlands were, I think that, or maybe, I'm sorry, now I'm mixing two different presentations. I saw one was, it was a survey, and wetlands were, I think, the least likely implementation of the 10 best practices as far as a farmer willingness to implement, is an OACI survey. And then just looking at what previous work, I don't think some of our folks, Margaret was potentially involved in some of the survey work that's been done, at least up in the Maumee, and we can provide that as far as the kind of perceptions, barriers to use, and what's more likely. That hasn't been done for this specific region, but I think it's kind of general understandings that might apply.
Thank you.
I'm actually looking at the Optus, CTIC Optus information right now for the Upper Scioto watershed. And they have, utilizing this is satellite technology, they estimated in 2018, 3% of row crop acres utilized the cover crop in 2018. So, you know, the current use of cover crops obviously is pretty low. And then, you know, I'm looking at their site right now, as well as looking at the tillage method. In 2018, 35% of row crop acres in the selected map area used no-till. 18% used reduced tillage with 30 to 50% residue. 15% use conventional tillage, and 30% use reduced tillage with 15 to 30% residue. So those are, you know, looking at some other data sources, those are kind of some of the current practices that are estimated. So that's some good information for us to look at and maybe try to make some comparisons against some of those things that I thought were interesting.
I think with cover crop and tillage information, it varies a lot across this watershed. So those might be, you know, Huck 8 averages, but there's a lot of variation as you move through the watershed and as we get more towards urban areas. So that would be an interesting thing to take a look at. And I'd be happy to help you access some Optus data that's not publicly available with some permissions. I'd also be interested in maybe taking a look at fertilizer placement.
Okay, thank you.
We had a comment from Jan Lehman about the management challenges with cover crops, and certainly that's not to be overlooked. Good point.
Mark, if I could add to that, you know, we're very heavily involved in cover crops, and we want to especially make it work, but the average guy is going to struggle with them without a lot of education. And so, you know, even my employees, I catch a lot of grief from them sometimes because we've had some operational challenges when you have, you know, I'm 6'4", and when you have rye that's up to my chin that we're trying to plant into, I get called some bad names. So, you know, I think it's just one of those things where it's going to take a lot of education. And of course, I'm heavily involved in OACI and heavily involved in the Ohio No-Till Council. And, you know, you're preaching to the choir here. We already do all those things you're talking about doing. But it's an uphill battle to get guys to go away from the way they've always done things.
This is Heather, and yeah, I'd agree. Don't forget the slugs and the voles and everything else, and herbicide carryover and termination. But you know, I think once you pass that hurdle, you know, then people start to see the benefits, and then I think it's more likely to have continued adoption. I did just pull up, because I had it on my phone, the slides from this H2 Ohio meeting yesterday, and the 2 top practices that were enrolled in the Western Basin, like Mommy, I did remember correctly, it was variable rate phosphorus application and overwintering cover were the 2 top practices that they saw interest in. Followed second by, as Jessica mentioned, subsurface phosphorus placement was third.
Those are probably the least costly to implement.
Mm-hmm.
Very good. Any other comments related to Arturo's presentation? I'd like in a few minutes here to move on to the rest of our agenda. Any final thoughts while you're thinking of something? I want to mention, as Arturo indicated, this is a work in progress. We will be receiving from Arturo a final report, and we'll do some additional scenarios as we've discussed. And so we'll certainly have more information on this modeling effort as we go forward.
All right. Thank you, Arturo.
Welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Very good. Let's
Sure. Thank you.
take a moment to have some general feedback. We have some, as we indicated, we will be emailing Arturo's a PDF of Arturo's PowerPoint, and we're still working on the details of the posting of this recording of the website. For those of you who are unable to actually see the slides, we'll have a video recording of that, and we'll post that and provide the link. Under announcements, Brian has several announcements. I'm sure you've got the list. Brian, why don't you go ahead and provide some updates to our advisory group?
Sure. So the first is I just wanted to inform folks that as far as I believe we had notified folks in the past that we had a 3-year commitment from the Hart Charitable Foundation in the amount of $750,000 to you know, as kind of a foundation of funding to conduct the project. We just confirmed, you know, second year's funding of $250,000 with the Hart Foundation. So obviously, you know, activities will be continuing. And to speak to maybe some things that I heard Heather and Jan mention, you know, a significant portion of those funds are for education and outreach, and to, you know, help farmers overcome some of those kind of technical challenges of implementing practices. So things like workshops and field days are definitely a part of that work. But also the other part of that is developing and implementing a payment for environmental services program. So Jim Klang is on the call. We're working through that process right now, and really expect to have in a couple of months a framework, I believe, in that, you know, late August, maybe early September timeframe, kind of that first round of a framework that we would like to bring to the advisory committee and to, you know, get feedback on and have you review that. So, you know, we have that definitely second year commitment. I also wanted to mention that as a project lead, we submitted a proposal to USDA NRCS for RCPP, their alternative funding agreement RFP that was out. That was submitted on May 29th. That request is approximately $1 million, which 70% of that funds requested would go towards implementation through the PES framework. And then approximately 25% would be targeted for technical assistance and outreach and education. So hopefully we will be successful in securing those funds, but the overall total amount was just shy of $1 million requested for that. I mentioned just a little bit earlier that we submitted a proposal to Ohio CIG Conservation Innovation Grant Program to conduct a pilot to actually bring triple superphosphate back into the watershed and essentially test and see if farmers would be interested in utilizing that source of phosphorus as opposed to or in place of MAP or DAP, especially in the fall application timeframes where, you know, we could potentially avoid nitrogen applications that, you know, nitrogen is a part of DAP or MAP, and may not be taken up by the, you know, any growing crop if it's applied in the fall. So it looks like that project is going to be funded. We don't have a finalized agreement yet, but we're very positive about, you know, that project being implemented over the next couple of years moving forward. That request was for $150,000, with the significant portion of that funding, really being geared towards helping retailers and farmers bring that product in the watershed and have it applied. We're also looking at submitting some grant application to complete some additional 9-element watershed planning activities, most likely geared towards the northwest portion of the watershed, more of those headwaters area, where there's actually, based on the modeling results we have so far, that there's a significant portion of nitrogen and phosphorus loading coming from some of those watersheds. So we will be submitting applications and responding to a current request for applications out now through Ohio EPA to develop 9-element plans. And I believe it's 4 sub-watersheds in the northwest portion of the watershed. And then just to add on to that conversation about 9-element plans, in progress right now in the middle Mill Creek and the upper Mill Creek, we're developing 2 9-element watershed plans in those 2 watersheds, along with a source water protection plan for the city of Marysville. So we're working with civil and environmental consultants to develop those plans. They had a stakeholder meeting, and that process is in progress. So we're looking at late in 2020 that we should have finalized 9-element watershed plans for those 2 watersheds and a source water protection plan for the city of Marysville. A couple of other things, along with the 9-element plans in the Middle Mill Creek and the Upper Mill Creek, we're also completing agricultural conservation planning framework analysis, and that's also being done for the Little Scioto watershed. So that's a USDA tool that can help us identify specific sites, specific areas in the watershed where some more structural based practices would be good practices, depending on the slopes and the topography of soils and sites in those watersheds. So we actually have the data set for the Little Scioto. We expect the data sets for the Middle and Upper Mill Creek very soon. We'll be evaluating those and potentially be able to identify some sites where structural practices would be good fits in those locations. I also wanted to mention that Brooke White has been on the call here, but AFT is participating as a board member on the new Sustaining Scioto Board that the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission has established. And Steve Stolte was on the call earlier. I know he's participating on the Sustaining Scioto Board as well. And, AFT has volunteered to be a member of a kind of a smaller working group, the Ag and Rural Communities Outreach and Education Working Group. So we'll be, providing input into that working group and bringing input from the advisory committee to that group as well. So as we go through, participating with the Sustaining Scioto Board, we'll keep you apprised of that. If there's any specific, things that we may come to you as far as feedback to kind of feed into both the Sustaining Scioto Board and the Ag and Rural Communities Working Group. So maybe look for some additional communication or soliciting of feedback for that. Mark, do you want to mention anything else? And then I'll open it up for some quick questions on some of those updates.
Do you want to mention the monitoring strategy of MORPC and soil health stuff?
Yeah, so Brooke at MORPC, their staff is organizing an effort to get feedback from various folks on developing an overall comprehensive monitoring plan for the watershed, where Heather mentioned looking at can we do continuous monitoring, real-time monitoring so that, we have better information on, kind of on an ongoing basis and a more comprehensive basis of, water quality impacts and monitoring in the watershed. So Brooke is coordinating that, and we'll be helping Brooke do that over the next, actually over the next month, I believe. So there may be folks contacted as far as feedback for that as well.
And Brian, I'd like to interject. Thanks to Tom Harris at USGS, we have some relative promise of perhaps some funding from the federal government for some additional USGS gauges within the Upper Scioto. So stay tuned on that front.
Any questions, comments? I haven't looked at the chat box lately.
This is Heather, and I would be interested in learning more about the monitoring plan. I'd say on two fronts. One thing that we're evaluating is these kind of new nutrient auto analyzers where they collect samples and analyze for DRP and nitrate in the cans, and then you can have telemetry and get that data real time. And they're only like $24K to buy one of these things, and it's just way cheaper than trying to send a human out and get samples. So we're going to be, I know Heidelberg's using one and has been trialing some at a few of their stations. We're going to be trialing one. And I think that might be a lower cost option to get you some higher throughput, higher frequency data. And then on the soil health part, I don't know if Brooke is working on that as well, but want to let you know that OSU has developed kind of a soil health protocol. So we've got a series of lower cost tests that we're trying to get baseline data across the state for. I know we're getting quite a bit of data in from every single county in at least the Western Lake Erie Basin, but we're also trying to get some preliminary data across other areas, and I'd be happy to potentially include some sites in your area in that, hoping to report on that in e-fields, looking at difference in soil health metrics across different conservation practices, and just really starting somewhere, getting a baseline for soil health and trying to get everyone to use consistent methods. So, and feel free, Harold, if others want to report more on that, but I think that's something that we could partner on.
Just I'll throw in my cautions on that. Heather, you and I traded emails at least on this, maybe conversation. What Steve Coleman has is a soil carbon test, active soil carbon test. It is repeatable, at least. That is one advantage that we have for it. The problem we're having is it's hard to go into an area. I mean, Steve helped me with a 30-year long-term trial, no-till versus conventional tillage, meaning moldboard, and we could find no differences in the soil health or even the soil carbon, active soil carbon after 30 years of continuous no-till versus moldboard plow. So I'm not sure that's the way to find soil health. I think we need to find a real good definition first, and then I find a test that measures it. That's not quite what we're doing with Steve Coleman's test.
And I think it's, at this point, we just want to see what the variability is out there and see if there's any generalizations that we can start to potentially make. And so including as many fields, as many different sites in that evaluation as possible is going to help us. N of 1 or N of 100 isn't good. You need, a lot of data points to start to be able to see if there's relationships there. So, and I know the soil health is very tricky. We're also looking at, infiltration rates and other things and how you can measure other soil health parameters as part of this study. I know that's something that's interesting to some of our partners.
This is Tom Harris from the USGS, and I kind of wanted to mention, some of this work that we're doing in Northwest Ohio in the Maumee River Basin. Is we have the automatic samplers that we collect the storm samples for just about every hydrologic event. But what we also do is we go out at least once a month and get cross sections. When you set an auto sampler out, you're only catching one side of the stream. So what the USGS does is once a month go out and collect samples, what you call EWI, or equal width increments, from the entire width of the stream. So that, and then from there, we do a correlation coefficient so that what you see on the web as far as, or what's obtained, what nutrient data is obtained, such as phosphorus or nitrogen, that's been, there's a correlation coefficient there so that represents the entire stream, not just the one sampling point. And so that's that's our basically that's what we do for Western Lake Erie Basin for the Upper Maumee watershed. And, you know, potentially looking to do the same thing, at least in one or maybe two of the sites in the Upper Scioto watershed as well.
And I'll share that that's the Cadillac and definitely the way to go. But if you have 25K and you need to do something that's better than, you know, a couple times a month or a weekly sampling, that's kind of, you know, getting you from the bicycle to the car. So I definitely agree that the USGS approach is awesome and preferred, but I'd be curious to know what that costs. I mean, it's got to be over 100K per year to do that. But if you have the funds or that is available, definitely, that would be awesome.
Thanks,
Yeah,
everybody.
actually, it's not 100,000. It's actually closer to 50 to 60 to 70,000, depending upon the number of samples. But you're right, it's more than 25,000.
Other thoughts? Brian, you've got some comments on soil health.
Well, just one last thing I wanted to mention. I believe at our first meeting, I made aware of 2 soil health case studies that we did with a couple of farmers in the watershed, Dan Lane and Eric Niemeyer. We are looking for 2 additional farmers to do case studies with. So if anybody is aware of somebody that is successfully implementing various soil health practices, you know, I'd be interested in talking to them about potentially participating and completing a case study that really looks at the environmental and economic benefits of those practices. And then we're also looking for potentially some farmers that are interested and not necessarily doing so at this point, but are interested in learning more about the impacts both economically on their farm and some of the environmental impacts, a predictive assessment if they were to implement soil health practices on their farm. So in either case, if somebody is aware of somebody that may be interested in doing something like that, you know, we'd like to do 2 more case studies of somebody that's implementing those practices successfully, and do 2 predictive assessments with farmers that, you know, are thinking about it and might want to or be curious about that kind of information. So think about that and let us know if you know anybody that might be interested.
Or if you want to volunteer yourself.
There you go. We are at 4:35, Mark.
Yes.
So we're past time here. I want to make sure we're mindful of everybody's time.
Yeah, I'll conclude by saying we're looking at perhaps end of August, early September to try and reconvene this group, and then also perhaps later in the fall, late November, early December, to try and have a final wrap up on some of these topics. So thank you for everybody's time. Please look for the PDF of Arturo's presentation, and thank you, Arturo, very much for a very detailed and well expressed presentation. And again, thank you. Stay safe, and we'll conclude. Goodbye, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.